Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fireside chat with Abi Noda on cultivating high-performance teams. I'm your host, Ken Rose, co-founder and CTO at OpsLevel. At OpsLevel, we make an internal developer portal that helps engineering teams quickly ship quality software. Now, before I introduce Abi, I want to run through some quick housekeeping items. The first is that today's webinar will be recorded, and we're going to be sending out a copy of the recording afterwards. We're going to be reserving time for a question at the end, and so if you do have a question, please use the Q&A section, which you can find on the right-hand side. There's also an upvote mechanism for questions, so if you see a question that resonates with you, please upvote it. We do have limited time today, so depending on how many questions we get, we might not be able to answer all of them, but anything we can't answer live, we will definitely ask Abi about and see if we can get him to send us some answers afterwards. Finally, we would love to know who is in our audience today, so please feel free to leave a brief intro message in the chat, just saying who you are, where you work, and where in the world you're calling in from. So with that out of the way, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Abi Noda. Here he is, perfect. Abi is a founder and the CEO of DX, an engineering intelligence platform that gives leaders insights into developer productivity and how to improve it. He is a prolific writer and researcher on all things developer productivity, and additionally, he runs the Engineering Enablement podcast and newsletter. Abi, welcome.
Ken, thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you here. I'd love to kick this off by learning a little bit about your background. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey into developer productivity, how it became such a central focus, and a little bit about the origin story of DX?
Yeah, so I'm a developer, and 8 years ago, I became the CTO at a small startup. And a few weeks into the job, CEO came along and asked me, "Hey, Abi, all the other leaders at the company are reporting metrics each month at our leadership meetings. Can you start reporting on the productivity of the engineering team?" And I thought to myself, wow, that sounds like a pretty reasonable request. And so I started looking up online, talking to CTOs who are mentors of mine, and asking them, "Hey, what kind of metrics do you use? Like, how do you report on the productivity of engineering?" And of course, I realized that there wasn't really a good answer. So I've always joked that I've spent the last 8 years of my life still trying to answer this question. I'm still trying to answer it today. But along the way, I've started a few companies, and most recently DX, which takes another stab at this age-old problem.
Developer productivity has kind of become this big topic in recent years. From your perspective, like what changes have you seen in the industry that's kind of driven that shift? And why do you think it's now such just a hot focus area for engineering leaders?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's always been a hot topic, but definitely it's something that's probably hotter right now. And I think there's a few things driving it. Anytime there's like big shifts in the industry, I think this problem and interest in this problem is magnified. And so certainly COVID and the shift to hybrid and remote work was a big driver. More recently, AI and LLM coding assistance has been a big driver. Even things like IDPs, internal developer portals, being a big trend right now. Trying to understand those types of investments is a big driver. So I think there's always something happening in the world that leads us back to this problem, but certainly a really hot topic right now due to a number of factors kind of coinciding at the same time.
Awesome. And for those in the audience who might not be familiar, could you just give a pretty brief overview of what DX as a company does and how it helps organizations actually measure and improve productivity?
Yeah, so we help organizations measure and improve productivity. We do this through a number of different ways. We look at both, traditional SDLC metrics, things like DORA metrics, things like PR metrics. But a big focus of ours at DX is how do we enrich your traditional metrics with qualitative insights that really help us go deeper, go further than just metrics alone, and give us insight into how to actually improve productivity and drive these metrics up. So we work with close to 400 organizations, both tech, non-tech, but all focus around this problem of how do we get good data on the current state of developer productivity and experience? How can we use this data to make better investments, make better decisions? How can we give our teams this data so that they can make improvements as well? That's sort of the space we operate in.
Awesome. So I'd love to talk about some of the specific mechanisms for evaluating productivity. But first, I'd just like to understand, is there sort of a right time for organizations to start focusing on developer productivity metrics? Is there anything that's kind of considered too early, or does it make sense even with small teams to start measuring developer productivity?
Yeah, this is a question I get asked all the time. I mean, at DX, we work with companies as small as 15 engineers all the way up to tens of thousands. And so I think in my view, as soon as an organization kind of reaches the point of being teams of teams, as soon as it's not easy to just go talk to people, know what everyone's doing, understand how everyone's feeling. As soon as you kind of hit that point, there's a need for more systematic tracking and visibility. So, I think as early as 2 or 3 squads is an appropriate place to start. And by starting early, you can also get a baseline of where you're at, so you can kind of understand as your organization grows how's productivity, how's developer experience changing over time, which I think is one of the most interesting pieces of insight you can glean from this type of data.
That's a really great observation, understanding not just where we are now, but also understanding the change over that delta as the organization is growing.
Yeah.
I'd love to understand, as part of the rollout of measuring productivity, you work with startups, you work with large enterprises. Are there any differences in how the organizations at different sizes go about, measuring and improving developer productivity?
Yeah, at small organizations, I think a lot of these initiatives are driven directly by the CTO. It's something they can kind of roll out with their teams, uh, train their managers on, state what's important, what to do with this type of data. I think at larger organizations, there's more niche use cases for this type of data. Like it may not be the CTO rolling out this type of measurement for all the engineering managers. It may be happening more in pockets to really inform specific decisions. So like a great example of this would be like a team that's working on a developer portal, like understanding, hey, like how do developers feel about this? How are developers using it? How is this impacting the business and driving productivity up or down? That's an example use case. Really, anyone who's in the role of improving effectiveness or operational excellence in the organization in some way, I think has a need for this type of data. So I think that the TLDR is, yeah, large organizations usually driven more by people who are in these roles where really getting the signal and data on productivity is crucial to their day-to-day job. Whereas in smaller organizations, it's often more just hey, let's arm all our managers with metrics and data so they can do a better job managing the work and managing their teams.
Okay, so in both cases, it sounds like there's this need to actually measure something. Just the scope might be different. In a small organization, it's across the entire org. In a large organization, it might be more for a specific team working with a specific guild to really understand the return on some engineering investment that they're making.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice. Um, I'd love to actually ask about some practical first steps that organizations can start taking to measuring developer productivity outside of just talking to you folks at DX. Like,
Yeah.
are there any actionable first steps that you've seen organizations be able to take to start measuring developer productivity?
Yeah, the typical journey, there's a couple different ways I see organizations get into this. Like one very common way is, someone says, "Hey, like we need a set of standard metrics for productivity. Like we need a way to measure this." Like someone in the organization, maybe it's the board, the CTO, had a platform says we need something. And so, a lot of organizations, it's not that hard necessarily to hook up to GitHub's API, start pulling some data, trying to put these metrics together. And so that's really where I see organizations begin, is just let's just scrape some data together, get it in Snowflake, hook it up to Looker. Um, but I think like where organizations start to really find challenges, the actual work of like cleaning and normalizing the data is actually like pretty difficult. And then like agreeing on standardized calculations for these metrics is actually a pretty big problem. Like people talk about something like lead time, but there's a lot of debate. Like, is that time from pull request merge to deploy, first commit to deploy? Like, what even is first commit? What are we talking about? And then you get this data in a dashboard, but it's like, oh, well, what we want to do with this data is get all the teams to be looking at this. And so there's this whole cultural and like operational component of metrics that you start having to deal with after you get some data. And so, yeah, but the starting point is typically let's pull some data together, get it in a Snowflake, build a dashboard.
Awesome. Yeah, you've started to touch on a bunch of different threads I'm going to want to talk about around culture and what to do with this data. Um, Before we get there, I have one other question before we go into some of the actual frameworks, which is when I was a developer, right? I now have the luxury. My title is CTO. I have this. I'm fortunate enough to run my own company now. But when I was a developer, I've been part of initiatives where they were measuring developer productivity, and there was this sort of worry that I had, like, okay, like is this going to be used to justify some bad action against me or people on my team? How do you kind of think about speaking to engineering leaders that might share a similar concern, where there can be this kind of negative interpretation of how metrics might be used inside of an engineering organization?
Yeah, it's a really nuanced subject because, to be honest, sometimes that is what some engineering leaders want to do with the data. Um, and that's a whole topic in of itself. Like, is that good? Is that bad? But I think generally what we see as best practice is, you know, that this data is really in service of developers, right? Like if the goal of this data is, hey, let's help the organization be more productive, let's enable developers to be more productive, like this data is really for the benefit of developers and everyone in the organization as a way of gauging where is there friction, where is there opportunity to make tools and processes more efficient so we can make investments. So I think really just positioning all this type of data and metrics in a way where it's in service of developers is the advice we give to organizations.
And are there any effective techniques for kind of communicating that to developers outside of maybe just saying it, like this is in service for you?
Yeah, I mean, it, a lot of organizations don't communicate it anything, and that's like the one anti-pattern, right? Like then everyone just assumes, oh gosh, oh gosh, here we go. Like these we're about to get stack ranked by these stupid metrics. Um, Yeah, change management communication is really hard. So, proper email communication, over communicating multiple times, all hands, joining EM meetings, joining, town halls to really clarify, like, what are the metrics? Why are we doing this? How will these be used? How will these not be used? And getting down to specifics, like talking about each specific metric and here's why, like here's how this is going to help us and here's how we're going to use it and here's how it helps you. uh, you know it gets as deep as you want to get, but yeah, being really concrete about the why and the purpose behind the metrics is really important.
On that topic of specifics, I can imagine that having standardized frameworks kind of helps with that, because there's this idea, well, if people already know like about DORA or space, they can go from one company to another, and DORA is DORA or space is space. I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about kind of how you see the existing frameworks out there. There's DORA, there's space is popular ones. DX recently just released DX Core 4. Can you kind of walk us through some of those frameworks and the DX Core 4 framework as well?
Yeah. So the metrics frameworks landscape, so today, if you were to just like ask someone in our industry, off the street, hey, like, how do you measure productivity or engineering effectiveness? Like, they'd probably bring up DORA. They might mention the space framework, and maybe they would mention the DevX framework, which is something I was involved with publishing last year. And then there's this DX Core 4 thing, which we just published. So I'll kind of briefly walk through. So the DORA metrics are the four key metrics, which came out of this book, Accelerate, almost over a decade ago now. And they're definitely like the most popular, most well known. They're sort of viewed as a standard. And I think like DORA metrics are a really nice set of prescriptive starter metrics. It's a good place to start because it's prescriptive. Like, these are the four metrics. Well, just use those. The challenge with them is that they're pretty limited in sort of scope, right? Like, they weren't designed for productivity. They were designed to measure like DevOps and continuous delivery. They're very focused on like your system performance and pipelines. So a lot of folks who stand DORA metrics up like quickly realize, wait a minute, like this isn't really capturing the signal we really care about. Like, like, oh, like we're already great on our DORA metrics, but we clearly have a lot we need to do better. So something's not lining up here. And then the space framework was published in, I think it was 20 or 21, I'm blanking out, by also Nicole Forsgren, who created DORA metrics, as well as some other researchers at GitHub and Microsoft. And the space framework was really focused on developer productivity and the idea that developer productivity is more than just like measuring developers' output, commits, pull requests, etc. Right? That productivity is multidimensional, that you need to think about and consider developer sentiment and perceptual data as part of the equation. And so space was, I think, great at framing, hey, like, here's the right way to think about productivity. The challenge with space is that it was not prescriptive in terms of the metrics, right? So the paper actually has this very famous, table of example metrics. And like people who just skim through the paper think, oh, like those are the metrics. Like we need to measure all, there's like 30 metrics, right? But that is not at all like the intention of the paper. So like as a result, you find a lot of organizations who are quote unquote doing space or trying to do space. Like it's kind of like Backstage actually, right? So like Backstage, people think, oh, it's a developer portal, but then it's actually like a framework for building your own developer portal. So
Right.
space is very similar. It's actually like building blocks and a conceptual framework for coming up with your own metrics. So it's really hard because it just kind of throws you back into that problem. And so then the DevX framework, which we published a couple years after space, really, as the name implies, was focused on developer experience. It kind of double clicked into the how do you measure sentiment, which the space framework kind of opened up as an idea. So went really deep into how to use self-reported data, how do you measure developer sentiment, how do you combine that with other types of metrics, like what even is developer experience. Problem with that framework is that it's just focused on developer experience and it's sort of isolated from the broader concepts and definitions of productivity. So we had these three frameworks, and at DX, the folks who like Nicole, Margaret Answer, the people behind all these frameworks are part of our team. They're research advisors. And so after we published the DevX framework, people would constantly ask us like, okay, now there's three frameworks. So please tell us, like, how do we actually get started? There was even like a Gartner poll that was like, which framework should you use? DORA, Space, or DevX. They were like voting, and it's sort of the wrong way to frame the problem because they all are actually kind of interrelated and they all have important lenses into the problem. And so that's how the DX4 Core 4 came about. We felt the need to provide a consolidated and prescriptive recommendation of how do you take all these frameworks and put them together? What is really the right starting point for organizations to get started? And so the DX Core 4 encapsulates all the different frameworks. It's sort of one framework to rule them all, and it's not perfect. There's a lot of different ways you can get into this problem, but it's at least our standardized recommendation for here's how to get started measuring productivity, factoring all the prior art in this field.
Okay, so to kind of summarize that, so DORA was sort of this very prescriptive, easy to get started, but not applicable for every kind of team, right? It was good at DevOps, but not good at others. Space was there's a great framework at the Backstage. There's a great framework here, but it's an exercise left to the reader to figure the actual metrics you need to go. Here's 30 examples, and people pulled the wrong thread there. DX Core 4 was great for developer experience, but not developer productivity. And so now with DevX
framework.
Sorry, my apologies. DevX was great for developer experience, not developer productivity. And our DX Core 4 tries to unite them all. And it's not that they're different. It's actually there's some overlap between DX Core 4 and DORA and Space and DevX.
Exactly. Yeah, good recap.
Awesome. I'd love to actually dive into a little bit of some of the metrics behind DX Core 4 because I noticed there's speed and quality which come out of the DORA metrics are a main part of the DX Core 4 framework. There's also a notion of effectiveness, right? And effectiveness I saw was this developer experience index. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that's calculated? Because when I was reading it, it seems like that's kind of a black box. There's these different factors that go into it, but can you give me a little bit more of the zhuzh behind how that's calculated?
Yeah, so developer experience index is sort of our instantiation of the DevX framework, which we published last year. So it's our sort of, you can almost think of it as like the Gallup Q12 or whatever, but for developer experience, right? It's a heavily research backed measurement instrument. It's survey based for developer experience that has a lot of data behind it that correlates it to business outcomes like efficiency, retention, employee engagement. So a lot of data behind or demonstrating the predictive power. So for example, with the developer experience index, we can say, hey, like a 1 point increase in your developer experience index score equates to this many dollars of efficiency gains recouped. Um, and the reason why this is really important is because one of the biggest challenges with developer experience, like as developers and as people like us who are really close to development work, like we intuitively understand the importance of developer experience, and just to like try to avoid buzzword, like when I say developer experience, I mean like the friction in our work. Like how long do you wait for code reviews? How long does it take to build and deploy? How long does it take you to even find information in the organization? So friction points in the developer workflows. And the challenge is that we found that when you kind of elevate that conversation around developer experience, it eventually bubbles up to like the CFO and CEO, and they go, developer experience, man, like aren't our developers already treated really well? Like, aren't they already pampered? Like, I don't care about this, right? Like, why does this matter to the business? This sounds like terrible. And so the whole thing with developer experience is like framing it in the right way and being able to tie it to things like dollars so it actually matters to the business. And so that's one of the reasons actually in the core 4 framework developer experience is framed under the dimension of effectiveness. Like we didn't call that developer experience. We didn't call it developer happiness. We intentionally called it effectiveness because that's the lens we want CEOs, CFOs to be thinking about developer experience is that, oh, this is really a signal on how efficiently and effectively we deliver software. And then by being able to tie it to dollars, folks who are trying to improve developer experience can really go make the business case and say, hey, by implementing this IDP, this developer portal, it'll affect these drivers that are part of the DXI. And we would, estimate and model that this will save us this many dollars per year that we can recoup in terms of efficiency. So that's kind of the idea behind the developer experience index. It is proprietary right now. We're likely going to open source it pretty soon.
That's awesome to hear that it might be open source, but yeah, so it does take in these factors. Now, the factors you mentioned, are they calculated through surveys or are they calculated through looking at just other signals that are already going on in the organization?
Purely surveys for the developer experience index.
Got it. Something you've written a lot about, Abi, is the idea of like drawing on qualitative data. Can you talk to me about just some of the importance of that? Why like kind of quantitative only frameworks maybe aren't sufficient?
Yeah. I mean, this has been the topic, on the forefront of my mind for the past several years. So hopefully I can articulate a good case for qualitative data. First of all, when we say qualitative data, what we mean is self-reported data, right? Like there's a naming problem too, because qualitative really means like free form text, right? Like you can actually have survey data that's quantitative also. But anyways, we won't digress into that. Um, like the reason why this qualitative or self-reported data is so important is fundamentally because just looking at data from Git, Jira, CI/CD just doesn't give us the full picture or full understanding of like what's happening in our organizations and systems. There's a lot of work happening. There's a lot of friction points. There's a lot of things happening outside of just GitHub, CI, and ticketing. A few really concrete examples of like where this data really is critical. So the most common example is, let's take something like DORA metrics. A lot of organizations, they get the DORA metrics. Okay, boom, we're, I don't know, we're good, right? Or we have room for improvement. And then the next question they have is like, what are our actual constraints? Like, how do we actually improve? What should we do to improve our DORA metrics? And this is where the qualitative data, like having feedback from the developers themselves on, hey, here are the friction points, here are the problems, provides a really good way of understanding what are the steps that need to actually be taken to improve those metrics. So I'd say that's the number one case to be made for this type of data is like it gives you the why behind the what, right? The what being, hey, this is what our metrics are telling us. but why are the metrics what they are, and how do we improve? Two other reasons for qualitative data. One is just like perceptual measures are really important. Like for anyone who's done endurance sports, there's this idea of like measuring effort with either heart rate or something called self-report, like perceived rate of exertion. And I think that concept really carries over well to software engineering, where like, yeah, you can look at like how many PRs is someone doing, but we know there's a lot of factors that can affect like number of PRs. So getting that self-report of how productive someone is equally important, and in some cases better, to give you like an accurate signal of productivity. And lastly, a lot of organizations that try to get started with measurement find that, especially at larger organizations, like doing the whole data lake, connecting all the data, linking it together, like getting accurate signal across a ton of different, I mean, this problem of aggregating data from different systems. It's like really hard. Sometimes the data hygiene just isn't even there. It's like not viable. And so you can think of survey data, self-reported data as one way to act as a stopgap, like a bridge, because you can get kind of a baseline really quickly with self-reported data, where it might take you 6 months to a year to get your data hygiene and analytics in place where you're getting accurate signal objectively. So the recap there is like the why behind the what, filling the gap where you just can't get system data, and then getting that perceptual measurement signal to complement the objective metrics you're looking at as well.
That's awesome. I do want to touch on some of the quick wins that can come up, right? You talked about the why behind the what, and I love that because it kind of gives organizations a direction to start fixing things. In your experience, have there been any kind of like common initial areas of investment that came up across organizations?
Yeah, so there are some trends, I will say. It is pretty organization specific. And the other thing with this type of data is we're always looking at it in terms of industry benchmarks, because to give you an example, like every organization deals with technical debt. That's just part of life in software. So like if you look at scores and metrics around technical debt, they tend to look worse than other areas. But when you actually compare it to industry benchmarks, you realize, oh, actually everyone deals with technical debt. Like normal is already pretty bad. And so, it's not necessarily where you want to focus. But I will call out, like, especially since I'm talking with you, like, knowledge management and discovery, like documentation, just being able to like find information is a pretty consistent theme across organizations we work with. And a lot of them tell us like, oh yeah, after we got this data, we started looking at IDPs and things like Backstage and OpsLevel. So that's definitely a really challenging. I don't think IDPs are the sole solution to that problem, but definitely a part of the solution. That's a big challenge for organizations, and it just makes sense. Like with the amount of complexity we deal with and the amount of employee churn tech organizations deal with, just knowing what's what is a really hard problem, as you know very well.
Yeah, whenever I have to explain what I do at ops level to like, my parents or my in-laws, it's like, there's a bunch of stuff out there and there's a bunch of people who owns it, and we have to figure out like who owns what and just keep that up
Yeah.
to date. That's actually like tremendously hard, but that context, to your point, is
Yeah.
important, and all the metadata around documentation for those systems and run books, like helping provide that map. I agree with you, it's probably not the only thing that would help improve developer productivity, but we've seen with our customers that it does help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Abi, I want to touch on one other aspect, back to the topic of DX Core 4, because one of the specific metrics, like I read, and I was like, oh, interesting. It was diffs per engineer, right?
Yeah.
And I think you probably talked about this in the past, but I'd love to get your take again. Like some, leaders, myself included, might worry about that metric being gamed. It's sort of like, well, how many lines of code are you writing? What advice could you kind of offer organizations around how to use that metric effectively and not fall into that pitfall of like, oh, how many diffs are we having per engineer?
Yeah. First of all, I always joke, um, I'm like a politician. Like 4 years ago, I was on stage at a GitHub conference giving a speech about like how terrible, like how you should never use this metric. It's just lines of code repackaged, like reserved, and I've more recently, changed my perspective on it. Um, and here's the thing, right? Like ultimately, when you're thinking about developer productivity, like big picture through the lens of like CEOs and CFOs, uh, they want that the business wants some type of measure of output. They just do, right? Like you have a lot of organizations still measuring and benchmarking lines of code, for example, right? And so like our point of view on this is that it's although PRs is very imperfect for a lot of reasons, it is the best signal we have today on engineering output. Um, and and the organizations we work with uh, generally find it to be net positive. Like they find it to be about an input into understanding productivity, with a few important caveats on how to use it. So the first is that it always should be part of a basket of metrics, which it is in the core four, right? It's one of many dimensions and many metrics that counterbalance each other. So by measuring something like PRs per engineer alongside developer experience and quality and engineering time spent, like there's natural tension in these metrics. And so, I mean, just hypothetically, if an organization were to just, hey, we want more PRs, we want more PRs, like you would expect those other metrics to dip. So that would kind of tell that story and prevent over indexing in one area or gamification in one area. Now, the problem of like Goodhart's law, like people fluffing the metrics, that's where, first of all, the communication we talked about earlier, the change management of like, what are we using these metrics for is super important. And secondly, and we articulate this in the Core 4 framework, uh, metrics like PRs per engineer should never be looked at the individual level. It should only be an aggregate metric. It should never be tied to bonuses or performance rewards, right? As soon as you do that, you are creating an environment where there's incentive to fluff the numbers, and then your signal becomes worthless. So again, imperfect signal, but a signal I think businesses need and want, and can be deployed effectively as long as you avoid a couple of the malpractices that I articulated.
That's really interesting. Um, I'd love to change gears a little bit, Abi. Like a big focus of our conversation so far has been on the frameworks and how we measure and the specific measurements. Now let's say we get to a point, like I'm running a company, I have these metrics in front of me, I have some survey data. Then what? Like how should organizations think about, making change or implementing solutions, to these metrics? And I'd love if you have any, anecdotes or stories from your existing customer base you could share.
Yeah, not naming specific companies, there's I'd say kind of two main veins through which organizations are approaching the like then now what? How do we actually use this data? And it really boils down to there's two kind of ways to actually drive improvement. Like one is the sort of bottoms up approach. So hey, all directors, teams, EMs, here are your metrics. Here's the data telling you like where your biggest hotspots are, what you should improve. Like, go improve it. Like, come back next quarter and be better, right? And report on what you did. And that's something a lot of organizations we work with do. Not exactly in the tone that I just described, but this idea of we're enabling teams to sort of have a continuous improvement process. Of course, that's not easy to do, especially at larger organizations. That's a major, like getting anyone to do anything in a big organization is really hard, as I'm sure you've seen with your product as well. But, driving that through, live operational reviews, driving that through a lot of communication, highlighting teams that are doing this well and celebrating that, enabling through best practices, and spotlighting, hey, here are patterns and practices that are working for folks. I'll go into, driving that kind of flywheel of continuous improvement. And then there's the more sweeping or top-down approach, and I think this is where platforms like IDPs and a lot of other bespoke internal development tooling comes into play is, what are the shared areas of friction? What are like global problems that can be tackled more centrally? And then, those are tackled through either making investments in third-party vendors or, internal platform teams really focusing in on, oh, these are the areas that would help our developers the most. So that combination of like the bottoms up continuous improvement combined with a more tops down, you know, initiative focus driven typically through like platform teams or other people in enablement roles, like that's the combination of things that leads to like a cycle of how to leverage this data and how to drive real results in the organization.
That's interesting. And so I could imagine a world where, in that top-down approach, platform teams could use some of this context as input for their own roadmap to figure out what are the areas of investment to go pursue.
Exactly. And not just that, but then a quarter later showing, hey, like we actually had impact. Like we moved the needle, like this big thing we invested in or built, like here's how it impacted the business. So yeah, this data I think is really kind of fundamental for like platform teams because you talk to most platform teams, they say, yeah, our mission is to improve productivity. Well, if you don't have a way of like telling that story, you're at risk of kind of being like a potentially unnecessary cost center in the business, right? So,
Right.
so this data, you need it to justify your existence and show your impact.
One risk I can imagine is, platform teams being comprised of engineers kind of know what the problems are. Like, yes, obviously we need CI/CD, obviously we need compliance, obviously we need security, but it's to your point earlier, being able to reflect that to the rest of the business and understand the actual return on investment that team is having.
Exactly. Yes, it's a universal problem. Every platform team leader I talk to, especially in the last year, there's been a lot of layoffs, and I think platform organizations have been disproportionately affected by RIFs because they often, they're working on cool stuff to help developers, but like the ROI on that is often not well articulated, and as a result, it's a cost center that feels non-critical.
Yeah. What happens, Avi? Let's say an organization they're not doing well, right? And they have a variety of opportunities for improvement across multiple areas. Are there any frameworks or any guidance you can provide to how to start thinking about where or to prioritize competing areas where the developer product metrics are lacking?
Yeah, great question. Um, I'm working on a book with Nicole Forsker Connection. She came up with a pretty good framework. When we work with organizations, first of all, we wish there were like a 5-step like formulaic checklist to like make decisions on strategy, but there just isn't. I mean, it's like being a product manager in any other function. Like it's a very complex set of trade-offs, and it's not easy to like come up with a scoring system to like decide what to work on. Um, but like some considerations that are really important. First of all, is like actually identifying what's even good or bad. And as I mentioned earlier, that's a challenge in of itself because you have to kind of uh, weigh both. Hey, like what is our view of like what is the data saying people are most unhappy about, or having the most friction in? But you have to weigh that against the benchmarks to like normalize it and say, okay, like well, how much of this is normal and how much of this is actually like a gap? And then when it comes to like deciding what to focus on, honestly, a really important factor that can't easily be boiled into like any formula is like feasibility, both from a technical standpoint and also a cultural standpoint, right? Some things are just really hard to actually change in organizations for various reasons. So, then after that, uh, again, it's not, there's not one way to go about it. I mean, you can look at, hey, how are these different things correlating to different outcomes? So you can kind of use like statistical ways of like analyzing key drivers of impact. There's also just a way like kind of like voting, like similar to like customer requests, like what are customers asking us for? Um, so there's kind of like the strategic as well as customer focused way of approaching it. But like as you can kind of tell, like there isn't like a easy formula. Unfortunately, it's really weighing in like your resources and feasibility and what are you trying to even like, are you focused on, because productivity is a lot of things. Are you focused on like retention? Are you focused on velocity or reliability? Like what are you even aiming for? And then what can you actually do? And then you arrive at like, what is your plan, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of context there again on in terms of like what are the actual priorities for your business and what cards you have in your deck, like, or in your hand, like what's the
Exactly.
feasibility, what can your team do, what are the capabilities that they have? No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, Abby, around culture. Also, like I can imagine that you might have productivity data that indicates some cultural or organizational change is necessary beyond just like, yeah, we need to make CI/CD faster. And that kind of culture change can be challenging to achieve. Any, again, case studies or advice you can offer engineering leaders that are tasked with driving these types of changes, but facing kind of cultural roadblocks?
And there's politics involved. I think we spend a lot of time almost coaching the leaders we work with on how to present and talk and advocate for change effectively. Um, some of the advice we give, like boil it down in dollars, right? Like speak in the terms that matter to the business, like time and money. Benchmarks are really helpful, right? Like people respond to that. It's very persuasive to oh, our lead time's X, no one cares. Oh, our lead time's worse than our competitor, people care, right? Um, and you know, ultimately, it's about being really data driven, speaking in terms of the business, and being able to go pitch that story eloquently, using the right decks and docs, and so again, no like silver bullet, but definitely boiling it down to time and money, leveraging benchmarks. Align. So another important thing is we find is that a lot of people in these roles of like improving productivity are a little bit like off on their own island. Like they're thinking about DORA space and all this stuff, but like when it's time to go like get money from the CFO is like, how does this matter for anything? And so we give a heavy focus on even before you're at the point of like pitching things or even benchmarking, like you need to have an aligned definition of productivity that is resonant with your CEO, CFO. And that's where like DX Core 4 also comes in. Like we've really designed that to be operationally relevant to all these key stakeholders, not just the engineering people. And because like if you can't actually agree on what productivity is and what the key indicators are, like you have no starting point for even talking about like where you're at and how you're going to make things better. So getting that shared aligned definition and view of productivity is also a really important starting point.
We have a few minutes left here, and I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the recent State of DevOps report that came out. For our listeners, every year Abby, you can actually probably correct me. The DORA organization, the DORA research group, publishes their annual State of DevOps report. I'm assuming you've read it. Any findings from this year's report that you found surprising or interesting?
Well, the main one we've been talking about on my newsletter and whatnot is the finding around Gen AI, like boosting individual productivity, but sort of having some negative impact on organizational performance. I think that was like the headline, attention grabbing key finding, which I think is really interesting. I think it's not something we've really seen in our data yet, for what it's worth, but we're definitely seeing AI coding assistants being a boost to productivity and benefiting developer experience. But it's really interesting the way that the DORA team looked at that data, like, and told the story around it of, hey, like, we're producing more code and larger batches. And so actually it's sort of hurting some of the indicators they look at for organizational performance. Now, important to caveat, like again, the DORA report focuses on the DORA metrics as kind of how they're measuring like the outcome. And so, putting like a critical hat on, I don't think they're capturing the full story of like, I think it's a little bit missing the full picture to say, hey, like AI assistants are hurting organizational performance. I think it's a little bit of a leap to make that claim. I think, based on their framework, that's the argument they're making. But that really stood out, and definitely has provoked really interesting conversation in the community around reactions to that.
With the kind of advent of AI and LLMs and these coding assistants and other tools that kind of, it feels like there's a new tool every day that adds AI to help developers improve. Any sort of trends that you can imagine that are going to, pop up? AI is the latest one that'll kind of reshape or rethink how, engineering organizations should approach developer productivity. Like how will things change over the next few years? What's your prediction?
Yeah, I think I don't think they'll change as dramatically as some are either hoping for or not hoping for, depending on kind of your view. Like the data we see right now is a lot of these AI tools driving a couple hours of time savings per week for developers. Um, that warrants like the licensing cost of these tools, like that's a net positive. But it's we're not seeing, at least in the data, which is hard to get the full story, but we're not seeing like radical shifts. It's not reinventing software development or flipping the thing upside down. Like where I see really big opportunity personally, when you look at like what this technology can do and then what we see in the data as challenges, again, like this information discovery problem, like this is kind of what like LLMs are like designed to do, is like summarize, capture, discover information. So I see really big opportunity there. And I definitely see opportunity to incorporate LLMs into any type of developer automation, whether it being code review or checks, things like that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but I don't currently see the technology sort of rewriting the script around developer productivity in the super near term. I mean, if we get to the point where AI can really be sort of like a quasi developer, like that's when I think it starts to get really interesting. And I am asked that question. I've talked to CIOs to say, hey, like, how is what you do relevant in a world where we won't even have developers? and I and I say like, well, I don't know. Like that's going to be, how will GitHub be relevant if like we don't have developers? So I don't have the answer to that question, but I'm really bullish on how these technologies can be leveraged and incorporated to improve productivity. But also, I think I'm definitely in the camp of like the data we're seeing is much more on the modest end of some of the narratives around this technology.
Yeah, as somebody who's used a lot of these tools to help write code, there definitely still needs to be a human hand behind it guiding. And so it can be, useful in terms of like micro efficiencies or, helping bang out a specific piece of code faster. But in terms of like overall, there's still a lot of hallucination, a lot of incorrect results, a lot of bugs that get generated. And so it's not there yet. And hopefully I'm wrong. And in a few years it will be.
Yeah,
But yeah, anecdotally, I agree with that take.
yeah.
We have about 10 minutes left. I'd love just to look at some of the Q&A that we've had from our audience here. We have 3 questions here, so we'll start going through them. So I think one of the first ones is, what are some of the leading indicators that you may need to invest in monitoring and metrics? Are there kind of normal red flags?
Um, yeah, it depends it says monitoring and metrics. I think it depends, there's different kind of ways you can kind of back into this problem. So, I mean, certainly, if you're having reliability issues, those are usually really visible. Like when you're having downtime, things are breaking. That's one way to like kind of back into this, and like tools like OpsLevel like really do a good job at like focusing on this. I think, other triggers are, someone has a feeling, right? Like CEO has a feeling, like it seems like we're hiring more people, but like we're not, like we seem to be moving slower than our competition. Like that is usually a signal or a trigger for like, okay, but let's go look at the data to like really understand this problem. I think any organization making meaningful investments in platform engineering, developer productivity, tooling. Uh, anyone making investments like this type of data, it would be helpful to like both guide your investments and focus and roadmap, and also to validate the ROI of those investments. A lot of organizations we work with are use the data we provide to really like gut check, sanity check the value they're actually getting from different third-party tools as well as internal tools they're developing. So yeah, anytime you're about to sink some money or someone's asking you about productivity, those are good, I think, not red flags, but triggers for, hey, like some extra data here could help. The red flags would be like people leaving because they say it sucks to work at the company, um, things really being slow, like very obviously being slow. And I think just like that general pattern of, hey, like we're hiring more engineers, or we have hired more engineers, but we seem to not be going as
The needle's
fast
not
as we
moving.
think we
Yeah.
should. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great answer. The next one we kind of touched on a little bit. I'd love to get your take through the lens of this question, right? Is how can we shift the perception of tracking and measuring developer productivity? That's my own addition there, from something intrusive to a tool for growth where accountability, benefits both personal and professional development. What role can self-reporting and transparency play in empowering engineers to feel ownership over their work and hold leadership accountable for its management? So it's like a two-parter, I guess.
Yeah. And we've touched on this a lot in the conversation today, but yeah, ultimately it comes down to being, I mean, answering this question in your own voice, in your own organization, as you're starting to, roll out metrics or data, right? So, um, I mean, to kind of flip this back to whoever asked this question, if you're rolling out data, like position it exactly this way. Hey, like this is why we are doing this is because, we want more accountability around, how we're delivering and how leaders are managing their organizations. We want to make sure we're investing in you individually and collectively to like enable everyone here to be more productive and therefore be like more successful and fulfilled in their job. And to do that, we're going to start leveraging some data to help us understand how we're doing and where we're at, where to get better. And we're not this data will not be looked at by managers, at individual level, and we're balancing these different metrics against one another so that we're not going to over index and try to solve one problem at the expense of another. And hey, like developer experience is a really key pillar in this basket of metrics. Um, Here you go, right? Like that'd be like my elevator pitch here, but just articulating that and doing so really clearly through multiple channels, multiple rounds of communication. I think that's how you do it.
Yeah, I'll actually have one other part here around the self-reporting, and this is more for engineers that are answering, survey questions around what the state of, systems are or opportunities for improvement. Um, it's an opportunity to talk to management about the problems you see, and that transparency is important. At the same time, there has to be a level of empathy with management, right? To your point, Avi, they're in the best case, in most cases, management is trying to affect some positive change in the organization through the measurement of developer productivity, and they need that engagement and that input from all the developers. But it's not a great forum if you're gonna use that as okay, I'm gonna go on a rant and a tear and like really tell people what I think, and I'm gonna start critiquing every single thing that's wrong. It really has to be framed in a productive way so that it can actually be actionable. If it just comes across as like angry or frustrated, that's not going to be effective.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Communication's one of the hardest parts of this and, any type of large scale change endeavor in an organization.
Yeah. The final question, I think it's asking if there's going to be an integration. It says Platform X, but I'm not sure if I should read it as DX. The question is, any plan to integrate Platform X with OpsLevel or OpsLevel with Platform X? I don't know if I should read that as DX, but for better DevX and more synergies with. And I hit the space bar and muted myself. Avi, let's talk after, I think, to figure that
Yeah,
out.
yeah. I'm curious who wrote that in. Must be like a joint customer of ours. But yeah, that's really interesting. Platform X is like our tool for collecting like real time in the flow feedback for like developer tooling. So yeah, lots of customers integrate Platform X with all kinds of internal developer tools. So it would make a lot of sense for like OpsLevel to be one of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, curious to learn more about this, and yeah, we can chat after.
Yeah. That sounds great. Well, listen, Avi, thank you again just so much for joining us here on the webinar day. As usual, just every time I talk to you, I am just consistently impressed. And today is another example of that, just a really great conversation. I encourage everyone to follow Abi. I think you post most on LinkedIn, if that's correct.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah. So follow Abi on LinkedIn. Check out, DX, and they have continually just interesting content on their newsletter and webinars, and now with the release of their new framework with DX Core 4. Abi, really, once again, thank you again for joining us and for all the insightful conversation today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Ken.
Yeah. And for our listeners as well, thank you again for joining us on the webinar. We're going to be sending out a recording afterwards. All the best, everyone. Happy building.